Hello, everyone. This is the 131st episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 Letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview Scottish author and poet Ms. Julie McNeill as we discuss her book, We Are Scottish Football. This book is a collection of poems paying tribute to the history and culture of Scottish football. Ms. McNeill is an author, poet, and editor. She is the poet in residence of St. Mirren Football Club Charitable Trust, as well as the makar, the eminent poet of the Hampden Collection. She is also the winner of the Burrell Collection Hidden Gems poetry competition. Her other book includes Mission Dyslexia, Find Your Superpower, and Be Your Brilliant Self. She's also one of the editors of A Most Unsuitable Game, celebrating Scottish women's football 50 years after the ban. I believe that's set to be published in September.
Well, yeah, 30th of August, yeah. So it's whirring through the printer as we speak, definitely.
So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Can you introduce yourself and your connection and trajectory into Scottish football?
Yeah, so I'm Julie McNeill. I live in Glasgow with my two children. I have been a football fan all of my life, really. And just in the last sort of 6 or 7 years, my poetry world and my football world have aligned. So I've been doing them both separately. I've been writing forever, writing as a child, writing as a teenager, and I went and studied creative writing at university as well. So I've been writing and writing forever and been a football fan, but really it was 2018 in Scotland, the women's national team got to the World Cup for the first time in a long, long time. And there was a kind of wave of optimism and excitement that spread across Scotland at that time. So as a writer, that's something that, grabs you. So I wrote and wrote and wrote poems about my daughter watching these games and kind of following these brilliant women. And so that's where it all really began in terms of writing about football. But it's been a huge part of my life for as long as I can remember, really.
Was this World Cup qualification, was this what prompted you to write a book of poems regarding Scottish football history and fandom culture, or was there more?
The fandom, so the book's in two halves. The first half is about something that we'll maybe talk about, which is the Football Square Mile, which is an area of Glasgow that's been set up as an open-air museum to preserve and protect the history of Scottish football and what Scottish football has brought to the world. And then the second half of the book is a celebration of being a football fan, and a mother of football fans, and a wife of a football fan, and everything around the kind of culture of football in Scotland. The second half of the book just has been organic. I've been writing that forever, little poems when I go to games, poems about my daughter, poems about my son, just that's kind of been a bit more organic. The first part of the book was a kind of big research project, really. I was involved with the Hampden Collection, as you mentioned earlier, and it was the Hampden Collection that set up this Football Square Mile and demarked all these areas of interest and historical importance in Glasgow. And I was involved in that project, and the stories for each of these sites are so interesting and phenomenal, and I can't believe every day people are passing these areas and don't know that these are the things that have happened here. So I thought each one of those sites deserved a poem to kind of celebrate the thing that had happened in that place. So the first half of the book came from my involvement with the Hampden Collection and involvement in setting up this Football Square Mile.
How did you decide to have the format like that? Like the first part, like you said, the history, and the second part, the fan culture?
I think it came organic. I mean, I had the second part written as its own kind of standalone section, really. That was just my collection of football poems. I wasn't sure if that was going to be a book or what was going to happen with it. But that section kind of wrote itself in terms of just kind of charting that history of my life in football. And then the first part was a bit more sort of thought through. It was like, it required a lot of planning, it required a lot of research, it required a kind of different skill, I suppose, than the second half. And so naturally, I thought they complemented each other, but they weren't the same. So that's why I've kind of demarked the two things, really.
And what was the duration in the writing of all these poems?
I think 10 years in total. I think probably the first one in the second section I wrote about 10 years ago. And then in the first section, be the last sort of 2 to 3 years, really, writing the ones around about the football square mile.
Is there a tradition of poetry in remembrance of Scottish football history?
There is. Scotland is a nation of storytellers. That's what we kind of pride ourselves on in Scotland, is that we like this kind of oral tradition of sitting around a fire and telling your stories, and a lot of those were told through poetry. So there's a history and tradition of that kind of culture in Scotland. And we seem to be doing something a bit strange and different in Scotland, that a lot of our national football clubs now have poets. So that's a fairly new, I would say in the last 10 years or so, clubs have been adopting people to tell the stories of their clubs, because they're realizing that, yes, their clubs are about the results, and the clubs are about their fans, and their clubs are about the kits, but they're also about these stories, these legacies of what their clubs have brought to their communities. And one of the ways that you can access people that potentially are not what you would typically call football people is through stories and through poetry. So there's a great poet, Stephen Watt, who would be very interesting for you to talk to. He was probably one of the first that really took that forward. He was the poet in residence at Dumbarton Football Club. He wrote a poem for every match programme. He wrote a poem for every event the club were kind of going through at the time. And he really kind of marked the way, I think, for a lot of this great revolution of Scottish poetry.
I believe most of us non-Scottish football fans have heard of Hampden because of the stadium name. We might not be familiar and have no concept of who the individual was. Can you describe John Hampden and his importance to Scottish culture?
Kind of going back to the kind of 17th century, there was a terrace built in Glasgow called Hampden Terrace. Now, it was built by the Eadie brothers. There was two brothers that built a lot of these kind of tenement terraces in Glasgow. And what they did was they named them after a kind of revolutionary figure or an important figure. So this particular terrace was called Hampden Terrace, and it was named after a parliamentarian, John Hampden, who was famous for not levying the shipping tax on the local population. So the king had requested money for his fleet of ships. And because it hadn't gone through a kind of proper process through Parliament, hadn't been voted on, John Hampden said, well, I'm not making the people of Glasgow that already have nothing, I'm not making them pay this tax. So it became a kind of, I suppose, a bit of a revolutionary figure, a man of the people. So Hampden Terrace was called Hampden Terrace. And then when the first Hampden Park was formed, the terrace overlooks the park, and that's where it got its name. So this legacy of this man that's a kind of, I suppose, just a man of the people, has carried forth to the National Stadium, which I think's kind of a lovely sentiment, really.
Unless one is a football historian, we might not even be aware that there's actually three Hampden Parks, and
Yeah.
your poems discuss this evolution. Getting back to your poems on the first part, referred to
Mm-hmm.
as the football square mile,
Yeah.
can you describe this geographical area and its importance in your poems?
Yeah. So the Football Square Mile is the first ever open air football museum, and it's in the south side of Glasgow. It covers 21 sites, and within the 21 sites, as you've said, there's the three Hampden Parks. So the first ever Hampden Park, the second, which is now Cathkin Park, and then the big stadium that's now Hampden Park. Also, in this very small amount of space, you've also got the birth of the Scottish Football Association. You've got the birthplace of someone who's described as the father of Argentinian football, someone who took football to Argentina. You've got kind of really important sites like Shawfield for women's football. You've got some of the cricketing links to football, because a lot of our roots of the footballing world have come from the cricket world. So we've got kind of cricket grounds in there. So within this kind of quite small area in the south side of Glasgow, these 21 sites actually chart all of the things that we should be really proud of. The inception of the modern game, the first enclosed stadium with a ticket book, and all of these brilliant things that we've kind of brought to the world are within this area in Glasgow.
Your poems kick off with Roland, about Alexander Watson Hutton that you mentioned, the Scottish father of Argentine football.
Yeah.
The poem Eminent deals with the tenant breweries. The founding of Celtic and Rangers are addressed in a poem called For Good, as well as Four Lads Had a Dream.
Yeah.
Can you broadly discuss the importance of some of these stories and poems?
Yeah, they're just remarkable sites. So, as I said, within this kind of really small amount of space, you've got the founding of our two. In Glasgow, we have two, which everybody will know, really, two really big clubs, which are Celtic and Rangers, and the rivalry and everything that goes on with these two clubs has kind of shaped the city in lots of different ways, positive and negative, over the years. The roots are fascinating. I mean, Celtic were founded by Brother Walfred, and it was about feeding the poor of Glasgow. That's the kind of ethos behind Celtic Football Club. And similarly, Rangers were four young boys, 16, 17-year-old boys just trying to find a space to play. And they played on this land that kind of, the rowers would be in the river, and they'd be cricket in the afternoon, and there'd be football in the morning. So the founding of all these clubs is fascinating to me, that it's come from these kind of humble roots really to these big empires that they are today. But this is For Good, which is for Celtic Football Club. On Abercrombie Street, the Carlton, Glasgow's East End, Brother Walfred rejoiced as young Hibbies of Edinburgh brought the Scottish Cup home. He thought, what if our lads had the same? A bright new football team wedded from the start to the common weal. A hot meal apiece, filling the bellies of the wains of the Glasgow East End. It's poor that look after the poor in Scotland. Always was and is. Scottish football is twinned with good causes from Gorbals to Gaza. The people's game for the people's good. Let's never forget it. So that was the kind of roots of Glasgow Celtic, and all of those markers are there today. The church where Brother Walfred was is where the football square mile is demarked, and you can see, you can go and you can scan these kind of QR codes, and you can see a bit of the history and the culture of your city. Even if you're not a football fan, you can see the social histories.
The poem Roots and Wings is a particularly nice poem that references Bridge Street. Now, this is where the Scottish Federation, the SFA, was founded. Can you discuss this poem further?
Roots and Wings was kind of inspired by that moment in Bridge Street where they founded the Scottish Football Association. The Scottish Football Association was founded by cricket clubs, one football club at Queen's Park, but mainly cricket clubs in Scotland. So there was this tradition of kind of playing cricket while the weather was good, and then playing football in the kind of winter months. So that's where our history comes from. So these big clubs like Clydesdale and Vale of Leven were the people who founded the Scottish Football Association, which I find fascinating. And the first president of the Scottish Football Association was Archie Campbell, who was also the head of Clydesdale Cricket Club. And I've been doing a lot of work with the cricket clubs because their records in terms of their history are far superior. So they have a lot of information, a lot of historical information that's been really interesting and really useful. So the poem Roots and Wings was about just really that process of, one of the lines is that what we can do for our children is to provide roots and wings. And that was the same kind of sentiment, I think, as what was happening with the Scottish Football Association. There was all these kind of disparate games that were happening and clubs that were meeting here, there and everywhere. But what they did is put a bit of a fence line around it and say, right, what are we going to call this? Who's in charge? And then that allows the freedom of these clubs to be involved, and more people got involved. And then there was the Scottish Cup and things kind of snowballed from there. But that was a real catalyst, I think.
So as you mentioned, Archibald Campbell, the first president of the SFA, there are other topics like women's football, the first floodlit match, the legend of Queen's Park FC that you mentioned, and the Cathcart Cemetery, among others. Can you discuss the importance of these?
I love the story of the first floodlights. So the first floodlights were 1878 in Scotland, and it was at the old Cathkin Park at Govan Hill. And I love the description of, because basically it was just a huge tower with a spotlight that followed the ball around the game. And so often fans would describe that it was like too slow, it wouldn't quite catch up with the ball, or it would shine in the players' faces and absolutely blind them as they were trying to take a shot.
So it was like a theater spotlight basically following the ball. That
so someone just used to sort of, move it and try and catch up with the ball at each point. So I love the description that. So this is football under electric light, and this is for the first floodlights in Scotland, which was 1878. It was less floodlight, more searchlight, a 50-foot tower and a single beam following the ball. Players were left stumbling in darkness or suddenly blinded. The lamp is too fast, too slow, off the pace. My son now plays every evening in the glow of the security light. The grass is a muddy bog, posts lean to the left, and the scarecrow goalie has lost a gloved hand. The light shines too bright, then off, then bright again. I see his beautiful face, strobed and weather-beaten, determined to play the game. It doesn't occur to me to tell him to wait for the daylight to come back. So that kind of image of this floodlight had reminded me of outside my house every night my son plays in the garden, but we have a light that comes on, security light. So he's the same. He plays in sort of semi-darkness with this light that flashes every now and then to show where the goal is. But the other stories you mentioned, Cathkin Park is a magical place. It's a kind of mythical place. It's a stadium that has a really checkered history. It's been kind of left to ruin in lots of ways, and you could walk by it. But actually, if you know where you're going, you kind of walk up this kind of mulchy path, and then this ghost stadium appears, really. But this is the problem with these histories and these places, that we need to know what they have been and what they are in order to preserve them.
The poems in the second part are under the title of For the Love of the Game. Like we mentioned earlier, this mainly deals with fan culture. Can you discuss some of the various topics in this portion?
In this section, really, I'm looking at all the different aspects of what it is to be a football fan. So that's there's poems in there about watching my young daughter be inspired by football in lots of different ways. There's a poem about kind of starting again, going back to that centre sport and starting again. There's also a poem about kind of women role models and how great that is that she's been able to see these fantastic women in front of her. There's poems about my son in there as well, and about how football helped him through lockdown. He plays for his football team, but even when we were all away from each other, that connection that he had to his friends through Zoom and, all these kind of things kind of is the thing that helped him keep going. It also deals with kind of family legacy. It talks about, those traditions within a family of, like, if you're a particular team, you pass that down, and what that means. You sort of sometimes passing them a big rucksack if it's, a team that's not doing so well. And so there's all that kind of element. And then there's 3 poems in there about a project I was involved in about football and hate crime. So there's 3 poems that deal with kind of the treatment of women, the treatment of disabled fans, and also the sectarianism that goes along with some of the kind of more unsavoury elements of football in Scotland. So I've tried not to shy away from, I know that football is not, this shiny, beautiful thing all the time, but it does do a huge amount of good. Clubs do a huge amount of good in their communities and in families. So I've tried to get the balance of talking about that, but at the same time talking about some of the harder things as well.
And it's fair to say that this portion deals with more contemporary football in contrast to your first part where it's mostly the history,
Yes,
the
that's
old
right.
history
Yeah.
of the game. Yeah. There are some references to the 2020, well, actually the 2021 Euros
Mhm.
as far as some of your poems. Was this important because for like a younger generation, this was really the first tournament finals that they had witnessed?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it correlated with that was when I was doing a lot of writing anyway about football. But I think there was this great wave. The team were brilliant at that time. You know, and there was this excitement in Scotland around we could really do something here. You know, and I love that hope that rises every time, despite our knowledge of how it's all going to end. But that was a really exciting tournament to watch, and the qualification rounds were really exciting, and it was a brilliant one to write about.
The whole
Um,
yes sir, I can boogie, that whole thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
the yes sir, I can boogie. You know, I've a poem in there about sending my daughter to bed, thinking, "Oh, we're not going to qualify." You know, it's all good, and then her sneaking down and being part of the celebrations when the goal went in. And so I think capturing these moments, I always think poetry is a little bit like a camera, you know, that it can sort of zoom in and capture these moments in time that you might somehow forget or not remember the detail of. And there was a great need to do that for me with that tournament, partly as a mother, because it was the first time my children had seen Scotland at this level, and partly as a fan, just to kind of capture these exciting things that were happening.
Two poems that I really liked were Zero Sum Game, which deals with the Celtic Rangers rivalry,
Yeah.
and Let It Play, which is about match days on school days. So, can you discuss these two further?
The Let It Play one was probably the first of my poems. I recorded that and put it on Twitter, or, you know, whatever it's called now, X. And that was the first one, I think, that kind of drew quite a bit of attention, because there was a campaign at the time. The first game that Scotland were playing in the Euros was during school time. So there was a campaign from football fans and children to say, let us watch it. Like, if you're not going to let us watch it, we're going to come up with some excuse why we can't go to school that day. Because there was such excitement, and some schools were brilliant and made a big fuss of this, and the whole day was, you know, they could come in their Scotland tops and they decorated everything, and some schools were miserable about it, you know, and just said no, it's maths that day, or, you know, and kind of let it pass them by. So the poem was about what that means to people who followed Scotland and have never seen them at a major tournament. You know, that actually this game is more than, you know, having a lesson off maths or English or whatever. This was a kind of seminal moment for them. So yeah, that campaign did quite well in terms of most children got to watch it at school, which was good. And the ones that didn't sort of snuck off home for a dentist appointment or something like that. And then Zero Sum Game, I think in Glasgow, everybody knows when the old firm games are, even if they're not football fans, because the atmosphere in Glasgow does change, and not for the better most of the time. So the centre of town becomes this kind of almost like not like a war zone, but almost, you know, that you can feel the atmosphere change really. And as I would say, as a football fan, it's not a game that I go to or would enjoy going to, a Rangers Celtic game. So that's one of these poems that I wrote for this football and hate crime project, because it was about how the atmosphere changes, not just for people who are invested in football, but actually for people who just want to go about their normal business in the centre of town on those days.
The poem Upon Your Shoulders talks about the restoration of Hampden Bowling Club, the
Yeah,
first Hampden.
yeah.
What can you say about this?
The first Hampden Bowling Club is one of the most, if you don't go to any other site in the football square mile, you should go and see Hampden Bowling Club. It's the pavilion is the original pavilion. It's the site of the very first game. It's such an important historical site, but it also tells the story of what we do with history, because the man who founded the Hampden Collection was a man called Graham Brown. He moved into the tenements, the flats beside Hampden Bowling Club, and he got a flyer through his door basically saying the bowling club's going to close, nobody's using it, kind of use it or lose it type thing. And he was like, well, I'm going to go and get involved. So he got involved and helped. And then he heard the old bowlers in the bowling club just talking about how this was the first Hampden Park, and it became a kind of mythical story you'd tell in a pub. Do you know that this is the first Hampden Park? And they'd go, yeah, and they'd sup their pints. And that was all, because there was no proof of anything at that point. So Graham, being Graham, was like, I'm going to prove that this is, I'm going to find the proof. So he did a huge amount of research and work and ended up finding an old railway map that demarked that as the first site, because the railway line ran right through the centre of the football ground. So that was the catalyst to all of it. That's the picture on the front cover of the book. That's the Hampden Bowling Club. That's the picture of the bowling club. Because for me, that's the origin point. If he hadn't done that work, if we didn't know for sure that was the first Hampden Park, sort of everything else that follows is a little hazier, I think. So for me, that's the real catalyst. And I wrote that poem, Upon Your Shoulders, just really to honour that site and to say, you don't know what it is that you're walking by every day. This wee bowling club that looks absolutely nothing is a really important site in terms of social history and in terms of Scottish football. And I got to read it for the first time probably 4 years ago maybe, at Hampden Bowling Club. And it was really special being able to read that under that original roof, in the original place that all these things happened. And then when I launched the book, that was where my first launch of the book was as well. So for me, it's a really important, emotionally important, but also historically important site.
So finally, let's discuss the poem with the title of your book, We Are Scottish Football. It's a beautiful reflection of universal fandom and not just Scottish. Does that sum up the vibe of your book of poems?
That was a really lovely poem to write, because it was written for the start of the 2022-23 football season in Scotland. And it was recorded as a kind of film poem, and then it was shown on, we have a program called Sports Scene, which is, the kind of football program in Scotland. And that was great, because it was about understanding or speaking to people and saying, well, what is it? What is it about Scottish football that you really love? And people came up with all these different things. And then it's just a simple refrain poem. It's like, we are. Like, what are we? What are we as football fans? What's important to us? And what we did when we recorded it was got people from all different kind of walks of life, all different fans. We had disabled fans, we had Rangers fans, Celtic fans, women, men. We tried to represent the whole of the kind of culture of Scottish football when we recorded that poem. So it was a really great project to be involved in, because it brought football to a different audience and it brought poetry to football fans. So it was a really nice one to do. But I loved writing it. I love reading it. That's one of my favourite ones to read, because I think it is that rouse. It's like a football chant, I think, a little bit. Like, it's like that rousing from the terraces, really.
In writing and perhaps in the research of these poems, did you learn anything that perhaps you might have known otherwise?
Lots. It's been a real education. That the first section, the Round of Football Square Mile, was a huge education for me. When I moved to Glasgow, I was kind of vaguely aware that there might be more than one Hampden Park. I knew there was links to Argentina. All of these histories were tenuous, really. So I was aware of the stories, but I couldn't have told you who these people were, where the first Hampden Park was, where the second Hampden Park was. my education in women's football, the same. I was aware of the names. I was aware of Rose Riley and all these kind of legends, but did I know their real stories? Had I really captured that in my heart? No. So the research around the first part of the book has been this brilliant, rich, interesting education for me as well. So it's piecing together these small bits of history that I knew wee bits of, and really this richness of the story when you piece all these wee bits together.
Any future projects for you on the pipeline?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, the women's football anthology has been a really, really brilliant project to be involved in. So that's been published by Tipper Muir Books at the end of August, and I've worked with two kind of football historians, so Karen Fraser and Fiona Skillen, and they are these remarkable women that have charted a lot of our women's football in history is missing, or it's in the social sections of newspapers, or it's in footnotes, or it's here, there, and everywhere. And they've done a huge amount of work in their academic life and piecing together this history of women's football that's never been done before. And I've asked poets to write poems inspired by this history. So the book is a collection of kind of essays, reminiscences. We've got players that have written their accounts. We've got kind of modern day footballers that are writing historical accounts, and poetry and stories throughout. And it's become this kind of rich tapestry of women's football, which obviously is not exhaustive. It's just, these are the things that we know. These are the things we know enough to be able to piece this together. I'm really proud of that. I work as an editor for a small press, for poetry books, but this is my first kind of edited collection that I've been involved in a collaborative way with these two historians. And it's a poet's dream, because they come with this rich stories and I go, oh, I have to write. And then I go away and be inspired by their brilliant work. So they've been great to work with, and we're doing a few events together over the next little while, kind of book festivals and things together as well. So yeah, that's been the big one. And then I might have to get back to writing about something that's not football, which will be interesting.
In closing, what do you want the readers to come away from reading these football-related poems, Scottish or otherwise?
I think what I've tried to do, Campbell Ramage is the photographer that's taken. So throughout the book, there's obviously there's poems, but for each of the poems, there's these beautiful photographs that he's taken as well, inspired by all of the different sites. And I think what Campbell and I both tried to do with the book is tell the stories. So instead of going along to all these different sites and just saying, well, this is what happened at this site, this is what happened, we've tried to connect them to human emotions or human stories at each of the sites. So I hope that means in some ways that it'll appeal to people that are not football fans. I hope these stories are important. I think they're important from the point of view of looking at society and how we've changed, and families, and how we interact with these things. So I'm hoping it will bring kind of football to new audiences. And I hope that poetry is a vehicle by which we can tell these stories in football, because they're reminiscent of football chants, they're reminiscent of the rituals and the things that happen within the game that I love so dearly. So I hope people enjoy the book. I hope that they feel they get something personally from it, and I hope it encourages them to find out about their local history and the history of the clubs, and the richness of what football has brought to communities.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. And as always, feel free to leave questions and comments. All our respective contact information and the link to your book are listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So thank you once again, and hope to continue these discussions on Scottish football history.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.